Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We were watching a series produced by the History Channel recently called The Men Who Build America. It's a 4-part series. It's on Netflix, and so we don't have cable television, but oftentimes we'll discover new programs, and watch these different programs, a lot of History Channel stuff, a lot of documentaries, a lot of personal growth type content on Netflix. And we just happened to come upon this program. It was a very interesting Netflix show from the History Channel. And the reason it was so interesting, it was chronicling 4 to 5 gentlemen in the late 1800s, early 1900s, who basically built the infrastructure, the Industrial Revolution infrastructure of the United States, and then it ultimately went on to the rest of the world. So these are people like Rockefeller, who developed Standard Oil, running all the oil of the world, basically. Andrew Carnegie, who developed steel, and all of the skyscrapers in New York and Chicago and other countries are built using the steel that was manufactured from Carnegie's steel mills. It was chronicling J.P. Morgan, the financier, who basically helped Edison get started and make the electric light bulb ubiquitous across the planet. So we all have electric lights late at night, and we can see in dark times. So these are men who, during a time period of history, the railroads by Vanderbilt was another big infrastructural development.
And then Ford.
And then Henry Ford, yeah.
The car industry. Actually, those were the 5 it chronicled. It was Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, and Ford.
Yeah. And so we were watching this, and first of all, just a lesson in history. It's interesting to see, the history come alive in a program like this, because you can see why things like labor unions are in effect today. Just from the historical standpoint, you understand why labor unions exist, for example, because of some of this. You understand why the government, in the United States at least, is very, very concerned with monopolies forming, because a lot of these men form their empires by building monopolies and removing competition through either force or aggression or fixed pricing and these kind of things.
They were all very Machiavellian, actually.
Oh man, I mean, it you watch it, it's almost it's like watching a movie, right? It's like these very, very wealthy men who controlled so much, and ultimately were responsible for building the infrastructure and the backbone of how our country, at least the United States here, and I would venture to say the rest of the world, any industrialized or developed country experiences life now based on these men who did this. I mean, Rockefeller building an oil business that he did, fueled kerosene and then ultimately the automobile gasoline that we use today in most developed countries. J.P. Morgan financing Edison has changed our lives. I mean, we live at nighttime now, and we've got computers and electronics based on the harnessing of electricity through Edison's inventions because J.P. Morgan financed him. Carnegie, the steel that built bridges and buildings that enable Manhattan to exist in the form it is today. So we are living among the infrastructure these men created, and yet we look at these men, and it's easy to, I think, demonize some of the practices and tactics they took. And rightly so. I mean, you look at some of the things that they did in the midst of this, like real people got hurt, real lives were impacted, and some negative things came from this. And so we've got almost this like push-pull relationship with some of this stuff, right? We've got these men who built all of this infrastructure that our entire modern lives are running under. And yet the way they went about that may not have been the best way they could have gone about that. And it's like, how do we navigate a world when the way we got to an end result that's good the process was not good? And what does that mean for us going forward? And how do we interpret this and move forward in the world, knowing that this is how the past has been, and even, not that distant past has been in some ways?
Yeah, it wasn't just that people's lives were impacted. People's lives were lost because of their business practices. Like, people died.
Absolutely.
Specifically because of their business practices. And when they were talking about when these men created monopolies, which was all pre-monopoly laws, like all those antitrust laws came into effect because of these men's monopolies. Because of these monopolies, the wealth that they generated was insanity. Like the equivalent, there is no equivalent of wealth on the planet right now to what Rockefeller had. Like Rockefeller in modern day terms was in the hundreds of billions of dollars. There's no equivalent. And I don't think somebody can make the kind of money that Rockefeller did because of antitrust and because of the inability to have monopolies. So the wealth that they generated was just mind-boggling. And like you said, at the same time, all the infrastructure that is the backbone to our lifestyle was built on those monopolies. In fact, they never said this. In fact, they didn't even make an argument for it in the miniseries. I just kind of picked up based on the information presented. Now, granted, it's one perspective or one telling of what happened. But I was picking up as we were going that I don't think that things could have happened with the speed they did. And I don't think the infrastructure could have been as solid had it not been a monopoly to begin with. Like, had they not been able to... And they were trying to outcompete each other. They were trying to outmoney each other. That became, you get to a certain amount of money where it sort of becomes ridiculous. Like, you can't possibly spend it in one lifetime. So now what do you work toward? And a lot of times it was competition. They were trying to affluent each other, if that's even a word. So there was really, like, for me watching it, and especially since I'm all like peace, love, and harmony and kumbaya around the tree, right? Like, I don't want anybody to die. I want us to have win-win situations, win-win circumstances. I want us to build infrastructure in an honorable way. And as I'm watching it, I'm going, man, had these guys not been dishonorable, had they not built these, what we consider extremely distasteful business practices at the time, I wouldn't have the internet right now. I would not have the business that I have. You and I would not be able to sit here with a microphone in front of us, recording a podcast that gets distributed to thousands of people and have an online, internet-based business. We wouldn't be able to have that at this time period in history had those monopolies not existed.
Or at least maybe not to the speed and degree we have. Maybe we'd still be in development toward that. We'd still be years behind where we are now because the infrastructure that enabled the railroads to move goods across the country and the electric light so people could stay up later and be more productive. So it added a lot of element to the industrial age. Like, these were parts, skyscrapers in New York City allow more people to move into the city. So more economic, movement can happen, more communication can happen.
ID exchange.
So it seemed to definitely accelerate it. And maybe it would have all come about anyway, but at this time period in history, there was a focal point of infrastructure building that has enabled us about 100, 120 years later to take advantage of this. And you could totally see in like the 1920s and 1930s where it was this movement of, the workers' right movement, the Bolshevik Revolution in, I think it was 1912 in Russia, and some of the socialistic ideas coming out in the early part of the 19th century, or the 20th century, probably came about as a reaction to some of these monopolies, these big business, literally the Monopoly guy on the front cover of the Monopoly game with the monocle and the hat and like the cane, that 1890s, 1900 view of the wealthy millionaire who really didn't give a crap about the working man or the working woman and just did what he wanted to do, and people's lives were lost. You could see the reaction that came from that and the rejection of that life, the rejection that that's a bad, like, it was almost like a moral and ethical evaluation was put onto that, and rightly so to some degree. I mean, there were some really, really bad things that happened out of that. And yet, I'm sitting here, I have a book sitting in front of me called Think and Grow Rich. It's written by Napoleon Hill, right? And Napoleon Hill, this is one of the most like classic personal development books. It was written, I think, in 1937. This book was written, and it's impacted entrepreneurs and great thinkers and intuitives and people that have changed the world greatly. It was written on the idea that Andrew Carnegie had, the great steel tycoon, of getting wealth into the hands of many, of getting this idea of creating your reality into the hands of many. Later in his life, he poured tons of money and resource into building libraries, entertainment venues, museums, cultural centers. And he's the reason we have a lot of these in this country now, because he used his wealth to give back to our society. And so we look at the beginning part of his life and some of the business practices Andrew Carnegie did, and then later in the life, giving back, not just resource-wise, but he inspired Napoleon Hill to write one of the cornerstone personal development books, at least in the world of finance and resource creation, that has ever been written. And it came from his idea that he thought other people should benefit from what he discovered as the secret to making wealth or the secret to moving through the world. So you have this interesting, just Andrew Carnegie alone is an interesting man because he built his wealth on what I would consider very bad business practices. He hired some people that were ruffians that kind of just bullied their way into dominance in the steel industry. And he did price gouging or price fixing and some other monopoly tactics to build his empire.
Well, and hired mercenaries to take out burgeoning unions like that would shoot them up and kill them. I mean, he didn't do that, but one of his underling did. One of his underlings did. And he cloistered himself in Scotland so he wouldn't have to watch what was happening. So he definitely had a lot of dubious business practices during a certain time period, at least neglectful. And
yet at some point he hit a place where he said, you know what? I'm going to sell all my businesses off. I'm going to take that money I get. I think he sold all his businesses at the time for $480 million or something, which today's money is just like in the hundreds of billions. It's just ridiculous amount of money today. And he decided he was going to spend the rest of his life giving that money back. But what I think was more interesting than just giving resource back, because I think anybody can do that, he wanted to give knowledge back. He wanted to give help back to people in some way.
Well, and I think that's what is really coming up for me through all of this is that question of, not question, but that when we see something like that, when we observe the damage that can be done through certain, levels of development for somebody else, we have a tendency to go, ooh, that's icky, right? Like, that's bad. That's awful. I don't ever want to do anything like that. And then we decide for ourselves that we're never going to do anything like that. And we create a territory boundary around this, unacceptable behavior where we just won't venture into it. And the thing that really became, again, it wasn't mentioned in the miniseries, but was really coming up for me is, I think this was necessary. I think this was a necessary level of development for us to get to where we're at, in the stream of time that we're at right now. Now, by necessary, I don't mean that it couldn't have happened any other way. It was inevitable to happen the way it did because it did happen that way. So that means it was inevitable. That said, there were lessons learned that certain people came away with, and they graduated to the next level based on learning those lessons in the previous level. And I've noticed so many people, when they see stuff like this, I mean, money is a great example of it. There are a lot of people who demonize making money. To attempt to make money, to want to be affluent, to want to build wealth, for yourself, that's a bad thing because bad people generate wealth and money turns people sour and all sorts of sort of these stereotypes we get in our heads. And there's plenty of propaganda films around this. And by propaganda films, I mean there's just movies about how evil money makes people or whatever. And so there are people who just wholesale reject the idea of trying to go out for money, right? That's bad or wrong. And I think, well, what if making money is the next phase of your development? What if money is the thing that you need to be doing in order to advance your personal development? And you have just wholesale judgmentally decided that making money is a bad thing. Now, are there other ways to develop? Of course, there's always other ways to develop. And yet, we only have a limited amount of time on the planet, and sometimes doing things like making money, generating income, like massive amounts of wealth or income, is the way to, speed up, leverage your development to become the best version of yourself so you can become influential and give back to the world in a big way. And that was just, watching that miniseries was just it was a great illustration to me of how we do this in general, where we decide that, that's not okay for us. And we reject what could very well be the next phase of development for ourselves. Another way to think of it, we did a podcast on the Graves model. And a lot of this can be seen through the lens of that model, All right. The industrial age was very much Graves level 5, right? In fact, I even tell people 5 is industrialism, right? Or in the industrial age is very Graves 5. That was really the beginning of Graves 5 on the planet. If you aren't familiar with the Graves model, please feel free to go back to that podcast and listen to the model, because I think it's a really fascinating model to see personal and societal development through. And when you get to Graves level 5, a lot of times people won't enter 5 because 5 is the time period where you're out for yourself again. You're out to make your fortune or achieve what you want to achieve. It's not always through money. It can be through other ways, right? People who go to the Olympics oftentimes are in level 5 because they just want to achieve on a massive level, regardless of whether or not money comes with it. But 5 is very much about achievement. And what I've noticed, I have a family member who is very successful in their field, right? They are at this point really hitting that sort of that event horizon of massive credibility and wealth and just getting to the top of their game. And they've been in Graves 5 for a long time. This is the culmination of all their hard work, right? All their, self-promotional achievement. And they're now ready to go to the next level of Graves 6. Now, Graves 6 is a self-development level. It is a level where you start to think in open frames. You start to understand that people have, everybody has a voice. And you do a lot of personal development work because Graves 6, a level 6, is really the first time that you go back and review all the previous levels, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And ask yourself maybe where you've got some wounding. Or maybe you need to go revisit that level and get those lessons back. And this family member will not go to 6. They won't do it. They have, not knowing the model, right? Not really knowing what any of this means. They've dug their heels in and gone, I'm not going to go there. And they define anybody in that as woo-woo or, airy-fairy or, they're not rationals. They're not hardcore rationals
metaphysical.
Like I am. They're all metaphysical. I'm a hardcore materialist. I'm not gonna go to that place. And that's the next level of development for them. They would be able to have a massive impact on the world because they would be able to combine all of this incredible talent, all of this voice, because they're a writer. They have extraordinary abilities to touch people through their writing. They have all this natural talent and built skill where they could really be making a huge impact in the world for the better. And they won't let themselves go to the next phase because they have somehow demonized what the next phase means. And I've seen this with a lot of different contexts. I see this with money. I'm not going to make money. Making money's bad. And yet making money might be the next level of development. I'm not going to do all that personal development, airy-fairy stuff. Like I'm a hardcore materialist. I'm a rationalist. So I'm not going to go that direction. And yet that's the next level of development for them. So we synthetically limit our personal development. We synthetically eliminate our ability to get to the next level by demonizing the very place that we need to go to next. And I wonder if there's a way to send the message of maybe just zoom out and look at that thing that you're demonizing and ask yourself if you're not picking and choosing what you're looking at. Are you seeing a big enough picture? Are you zoomed out enough to be able to see all the good stuff and the bad stuff that's wrapped in here and find out if maybe you could traverse the same territory, with integrity? You don't have to make money the douchebag way, right? Like if money is the thing that you're demonizing, you can be in integrity and in alignment with yourself. You can have an honorable business where you are transparent and open and serving people's needs, and they're running to you because you are you're a transparent company. And you are legitimately trying to make people's lives better. You can make money that route, right? Like it doesn't have to be, the dick way of making money. And yet if you see money in general as automatically making you a bad person, well then you won't be able to traverse that territory of making money in integrity, which is maybe the next phase of your development.
One of the things I think would kind of be the first step in this is, I think in my life I've noticed this in a lot of people's lives, as they grow and develop and they scale up from one level to another. And I'm not even specifically talking about the Graves model here in specific terms, but it could be the Graves model. We have a tendency to hit the next level and go, whew, wow, was I immature and ignorant back there at that last level? whoa, I'm going to reject everything about the last place I just came from and fully embody where I'm at now, as well as avoid going forward. Like, you almost feel like wherever you're at right now is the height of everything. Like, I can't go on. That's the next level's too weird, and I think I've hit the highest level I'll ever be at right here. And you tend to reject what's behind you. So maybe the first step in order to free yourself up to be able to move forward is to realize, recognize, and accept, and not reject levels you've come through. So let's say you've come through different levels of understanding finances, for example. You've gotten from, a low level of understanding how finance and money works. Maybe you become a business owner at some point, and then you turn into an investor. And instead of rejecting every level before that you've come through, accept the parts that still work for you at the new level, because every level is more like, it's almost like you've scaled up a view and awareness of the world, right? You have a bigger worldview. And so when you have that bigger worldview, you're like, wow, I was so limited thinking back there at that lower level. And you almost reject yourself and that level wholesale. Take the elements of that and bring them with you that work, that are good, that you learn from. I think that's really what we're talking about here is there was a time period in American history. There were some really crappy things happening. And people did lose their lives based on men's choices, men and women's choices, but primarily some of these big tycoon type men that were making these choices, and bad things happened, and also good things happened. And can we take some of the good things from that level that we came through as a people on this planet, and can we take the good elements of that and keep using them because they're still useful? And refine the things that didn't work out so well, refine the things that were not helpful to people and people lost their lives over, and eradicate those. So I think it's this idea of wholesale rejection or acceptance. There's people that think that Rockefeller and all those dudes back then were totally in their right to have monopolies, and that's totally appropriate, and that's just cost to doing business and building infrastructure. That's really a wholesale acceptance of that. And that's really not a sobered way to come to it, right? Like, accept all of it as totally valid. And then there's people that reject all of it. Like, it was just, they were totally evil. They had totally bad intent. They just hurt people. They didn't do anything positive at all. And again, that's a completely one-sided way to view it. Is there more of this balance to see the levels we come through as people in your own personal life on a micro level, and society and the people you're around on a macro level, that you can, as you scale up, take this with you?
That is a perfect point. It's so wonderfully encapsulated in how much are you rejecting the lessons of the past. If you reject the lessons of the past, you're probably going to reject what's coming up too. It's not a matter of rejection. It's a matter of, I think we phrased it in the past, integrate and transcend. Grab all the good stuff, integrate all that good stuff, and then transcend the bad stuff. And you're right. We are at a point right now where we don't have to have monopolies in order to continue to establish infrastructure. In fact, at this point, I would argue that monopolies harm us more than they help us. But there was a time period in history where monopolies helped a lot, right, to establish that infrastructure early on. So integrating that good stuff and transcending the bad stuff is the best way to go about it. And one of the best ways to do that is to track your individual personal development, track your growth, and ask yourself where I came from. What were the lessons that I learned from that time period in the past that are imperative to me now? One great way to illustrate this is, that horrible time period when we're teenagers and we're just like, we're the anarchistic, rebellious, your rules don't apply to me, mom and dad, I'm my own person, stomp your feet, sneak out of the house. That teenage time period where all of us as an adult, when we look back, we just kind of go, oh yeah, well, I guess that's being a teenager. One of the things that we learn during that time period is how to stand up for ourselves. For the first time in our whole lives, and unfortunately, our parents get, they get the fallout of this. But what we're really trying to teach ourselves is the ability to stand up for ourselves as individuals, right? It's the first time we're experiencing true mimetic independence. I don't have to think like everybody else. I can set my own thoughts. I can control and program my own mind, and I can stand up for that. Well, obviously some people stay there for the rest of their lives, but most people graduate to the next level. And they take with them that ability to stand up for themselves. Now, you can tell when somebody hasn't really fully explored that level, because it's very difficult for them to stand up for themselves later. It's very difficult for them to not just hand over and supplicate to somebody else because they never really learned the lesson. They never really integrated the lesson of standing up for yourself and having your own, mimetic independence. So do we just look back at our teenage years and go, oh God, like, don't even remind me? Or do we go, there was a lot about that wasn't good, but that part, that was necessary. And now that I'm an adult, now that I'm older, wiser, now that I'm like, in the workforce or running my own business or wherever you're at contextually, you have the ability to create boundaries. Like somebody steps on your toes and you go, look, nobody talks to me like that, right? Like you're not going to talk to me like that because nobody talks to me like that. That's a lesson you learned at 16 years old when you were like, F you, mom and dad, I'm not taking this. I'm going to my room, slam the door, listen to Cure or whatever. We always mention the Cure because we're old people and the Cure is what we remember as teenagers. If you grew up in the 90s, it was probably like Radiohead, and I'm so out of touch with music, I have no idea who the, slam the door and listen to maudlin music is, currently. That's how old I am. However, that said, that whole like, screw you guys, I'm going to go do what I want to. I'm going to hang out with my friends at the mall and you can't tell me no. That was the beginning of, look, you can't talk to me like that. I don't care if you're my boss or not. I don't care what position you think you're taking. Nobody talks to me like that. You speak to me with respect and I'll speak to you with respect. That's the lesson you picked up as a teenager, right? And now you're able to grab that awesomeness and bring it into, how you behave and interact with the world in a healthy way in general. So when we do a wholesale rejection of anything, like you said, that's a very one-sided way of looking at it. And we're not opening ourselves up to the very positive, necessary attributes and characteristics, the things that we built our whole identity around. We're not acknowledging that parts of those integral parts of who we are have come from time periods where maybe we were not so well behaved.
Now I'm going to go meta on our meta perspective. Going and rejecting a perspective wholesale, like you're talking about, can also be a stage that we have to accept about ourselves. In other words, think of this in terms of a meta perspective on the meta perspective of all of this. And that's okay too. Like there might be a time period where you go through that. In fact, there is an inkling of this in the Graves model, like we talk about, where part of one of the levels is rejecting all other viewpoints, all other worldviews. And so that's part of your experience as you grow and develop. And you're going to look back on your life and realize there were times when you had a position on some issue or some stance or some perspective that was so one-sided and wholesale this way, and you're like, wow, I don't think that way at all, but I'm going to go ahead and accept that about myself at that time period of my life, and I'm going to, and I love the words you use, integrate and transcend that as well as all the other parts, because I think that integrate, transcend is so key. And it comes down, we started the conversation talking about money and resource, but it comes down to relationships. I think of my first marriage, how I've had to integrate and transcend the things. I can't reject it wholesale, and I have to integrate, transcend the good parts that came out of some of the difficult times. Relationships, business, personal growth, your family, maybe your religious or cultural paradigm. All of these things, as you grow, you're going to have time periods where you're going to look back and go, I don't know if I like that whole thing I did back there. Like, I don't know what was going on for me. And I think that it can come down to practice by doing this with things that are outside yourself. That's why we started the whole conversation by talking about the tycoons of the late 1800s and the 1900s, is because if you can do that on a macro level by looking at somebody that's distant from you, removed from you, Rockefeller's dead. He doesn't have a direct impact on your life at all anymore. So if you're listening, it's easy maybe to look at him a little bit more objectively than maybe, what's going on in your life right now, the relationship you're in or the business that you want to start or whatever. And so you can use that. I think this is what's great about the past, is we can use it as a lesson for how we're going to live our lives in the future. And it can be a great teaching and learning tool for us as people on how we're going to interact with some of these things.
We are, for this month, we're going to go through an unofficial series of podcasts around business and money generation. So I do want to make a comment about specifically people who reject the notion of making money. There was a conversation you overheard between two people, and the one person was saying, how do I develop fast? And they said, make a goal of making $1 million.
Yeah. Actually, I think I read this. I read so much and so fast. I can never remember sources sometimes. So apologize that if I can find the source, I'll get it in the show notes for the podcast. I was reading about somebody that wanted to grow and scale up in a particular way in their life. I don't remember the exact tone. And the person in this helping them said, I think the best thing you could do right now is become a millionaire. And the person said, that's not my goal. My goal is not to make money. It was to be better at this one thing. I can't remember what the one thing was. And he said, it's not about making millions. Like, the reason I'm telling you to become a millionaire is not because you have to have $1 million in the bank. It's because in order to have $1 million in the bank, you have to become the type of person that can have $1 million in the bank. In other words, there are skills and development and tool sets you're going to learn in the process of growing your income or your resource to the $1 million level that you just simply can't learn unless you do that. And for you particularly, whatever their situation was, this is the way that will help you the most become the type of person that can have that kind of resource. So it's more about who they're becoming rather than what they have. And having that was the goal, but it would be a personal development path toward that.
So the reason why I thought that was such a great story or illustration really to put in at this point is we're going to start talking about how personal development is intrinsically linked to wealth generation. There is a lot of very positive things that come from wealth generation. And what I love about where we're at in the stream of time right now is that authentic, aligned, wealth generation that is about integrity and making sure you're in alignment with yourself is becoming more and more popular. You and I did coaching with a company called Zappos. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but Zappos is an online company that started out by selling shoes, and now they've spread out and do all sorts of different brands, and they do more than just shoes. But that's how Zappos started. And we did coaching. We've done coaching with Zappos, but we started out by doing coaching with one of their children companies called Zappos Insights. And Insights is intended to teach other companies how to replicate or model Zappos their culture in order to become more successful companies, because that's Zappos's claim to fame, is how they created a company culture that doesn't hurt them, right? It doesn't hurt them at all, that they are casual and laid back and have a lot of fun and play a lot and have this really wonderful, just sort of playful, happy culture has not ruined their bottom line at all. In fact, if it has done anything, it's increased their bottom line. They have very loyal employees. They get 1,000 resumes for every one open position, right? So they've got their talent pool, they get to pick and choose who they want, right? They get the best of the best, even for their entry-level positions. So Zappos has created an amazing culture, and Zappos Insights is intended to teach other companies how to model that. Well, I remember sitting in a Zappos Insight. They have what they call a boot camp. And I remember sitting in that boot camp when we were doing some coaching with Zappos Insights, and I was looking around at all these very dubious business owners, right? Like they were really like, how is having a bar in every department? Because that's what Zappos does. If you go tour them in Las Vegas, you will notice that there is a bar.
Do shots of vodka as you're touring.
That's right. Well, vodka is the CEO, Tony Hsieh. Vodka is his alcohol of choice. But if you go to different departments, you're going to get different alcohols because all the teams have different preferences, right? Like they have different poisons. And it's like, okay, so how does having a bar available for every single team, how does that help the bottom line? They're very dubious, but they know it's working because Zappos was sold to Amazon for $1.2 billion. So something's working, but they can't figure it out, but they're trying. And one of the things I noticed is that they know that this is coming. They know that this is going to be, and this is what we hear in like Business Inc. magazine, and I mean, everywhere.
And these people are sitting in this boot camp are Fortune 500, Fortune 100 company CEOs and business people.
Some of them were, yeah, absolutely. And so they know it's coming, but they haven't quite wrapped their head around how it's going to happen for them in their company. How do they change it in their company? And the answer is that's the direction we're headed as human beings. And one of the ways that we've gotten there is by embracing wealth generation. The reason why Zappos is where it's at is not because they were not successful in making money. It's because they were successful. They were extremely successful in making money, where they got to a point where they said, you know what? I'm just going to make this a happy place to work. I've just decided that. And Tony Hsieh's, his story is all about how he had this initial company called Link Exchange, and he was miserable going to work every day, even though this was like I think that company sold to Microsoft for $250 million or something. And Hsieh was just like, I'm miserable going to work. I hate where I'm working. I hate what I'm doing. This is my company that I built. So when he went to the next company that he started as an investor in, he was like, I'm not going to do that again. I'm just not. I'm going to create a company where I want to go to work every day. And because he decided that he was going to create a company in integrity with his personal desires and what he wanted for other people, because of that, he built helped build an incredibly successful company. And that's the direction we're headed as people. So this idea of rejecting money, if you reject the concept of making money, then you are actually behind all the people who have been making money and recognize that you can do it with integrity and have a big impact on helping create happiness, not just wealth, but specifically happiness for a large amount of people.
If you're listening to our podcast, you're, again, most likely interested in personal development. You're probably an intuitive, or you enjoy intuitive conversation. And one of the things that probably drives you, is my speculation, is you want to make an impact in the world. And you want to have influence in the world. Influence is important to you. Influence is something that you desire. And one of the phrases that always goes through my head as I think about making an impact in the world is affluence brings influence. So having affluence oftentimes can bring you influence. You can have influence without affluence. You can have influence without making a lot of resource and controlling a lot of resource. But I'll tell you, having resource, controlling resource, and the skills you have to build to make that resource are some of the same skills you have to build to have massive influence. Because you have to influence other people. You have to influence marketing and sales and product creation and employees and investors. You have to influence people and yourself in order to make that kind of resource. So all those skills you develop through that give you that ability, that platform, that personal growth tool set to then be able to, sit behind a microphone or get up on a stage or write that book or talk to those people or give that speech or create that product or invent that thing. It's that influence that you're after, and affluence can oftentimes build the skill and just the pure resource and able to enable that influence.
I've noticed too, there's an idealism that I think we have around the concept of money. An idealism that isn't always good. Like we're idealistically positive towards money. I think we can be idealistically negative towards money. Like this idea that generating wealth automatically makes you a bad person, as if the money itself will corrupt you. And I've noticed that, I think somebody actually once said this at some point, and I'll probably just be mimicking them. I don't remember the source. But money's kind of like alcohol, right? Like, it doesn't turn you into a jerk. It basically accentuates whatever you already are. So from my opinion, it's not just making money. In fact, I think people who go out for just making money, that's fine if that's what they want to do. And sometimes through the course of that, they can become quite enlightened and very, influentially positive. I always think of the guy from Charity Water, who right now might be the biggest, darling of of that particular nonprofit, industry. He started out by was a PR agent. Effectively,
he was a promoter in New York City.
He's a promoter, right?
Event and concert and music promoter, I think.
And it was all about him, and it was all about his personal success, and it was all about him going after what he wanted and becoming, powerful and influential and having a lot of money. And then something touched him. He went to Africa and saw just how impoverished people are, that they can't even get basic water. Like, they have to walk miles to get a couple of gallons of water every day. And it was so painful to him. He's like, well, I'm going to utilize all the skill that I developed as a promoter, and I'm going to apply it to this, right? So he didn't start out, my guess is he did not start out ambitious specifically to end up helping, small villages in Africa build wells. Like, that was not his end game initially. But because he had built all those skills, when that became his end game, he was much better at making it happen. And right now, he's like I mean, he's an extraordinary promoter for Charity Water. That's why it's a darling, right? Because of the talents he brings. So I don't have any beef with people just wanting to make money. Like that, I have no beef with that because sometimes some pretty good stuff can come from that. However, if you are a person interested in personal development, if you are a person who wants to become the best version of yourself, and you're simultaneously wanting to make money, I think that's a fantastic position to be in. Because like you mentioned, generating income requires things of you, especially if you want to be in integrity with yourself. That's the biggest piece. You can make money. You can generate wealth and be in integrity with yourself. You can do it. It's the more difficult path for sure. But it requires you to build skill. It requires you to look at yourself in a very interesting way. It requires something from you that just going the personal development path, I don't think will make happen. And just going the money generation path won't make happen. It's a combination of those two things happening in conjunction with each other. And I think those are the people who have the biggest impacts. I think the people who make sure that they are always in integrity with themselves while they're generating wealth, I think those people become some of the biggest influencers of the direction that society is going.
And sometimes it doesn't happen until afterward. And we go all the way back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast. You know, Andrew Carnegie made some decisions that I think were in the bad interest of people when he was building his fortune, when he was building his steel empire. He was making, I believe, bad decisions by who he hired to put in charge, and then they made bad decisions that ultimately killed people and hurt people. It was detrimental. And out of that, Andrew Carnegie built skills in resource management, development, in just resource allocation, all of the skills that when the switch flipped in his mind to say, you know what, I'm going to spend the rest of my life giving back. Not only did he know how to do it from a resource standpoint, but think about all the things that he had to learn in order to build resource to that level. He sat down with Napoleon Hill and said, Napoleon Hill, I want you to spend the next few years researching how this is done. I'm going to go ahead and fund it. I'm going to support it. And out of that, the book Think and Grow Rich was written based on Andrew Carnegie's idea for this. And now we use that book now to move ourselves forward in life. So it's this idea that, yes, you can do it in complete integrity. And what happens if you're at a stage where maybe you haven't up till this point, or somebody hasn't? This idea that you don't reject the things you've learned, no matter how you learn them. Yeah, they may not have been the greatest thing in the world, but realize the bad parts of that. Say, I'm not going to duplicate that ever again. But there are good things I've learned here. There are good things I can take from this. Integrate, transcend those, and take you to the next level.
And if you are about to enter a phase where wealth generation is a big piece of that, not looking at bad examples or examples of people who are not necessarily bad, but bad things happen within it, not looking at that and going, well, there's no way I'm going to do that. I mean, you and I know of a kid who came from a moderately wealthy family. It sounds like upper middle class at least. And he ended up becoming homeless for a while. He ended up becoming like a train jumper for a while. And right now he lives in a very, very, very modest, like apartment complex that I think is like 2 seconds from being condemned.
It's like a commune, basically.
Yeah, kind of like a commune. And I remember talking to him, and anytime we mentioned anything about money, he just emotionally shut down.
Not only that, at one point he got up and walked out of the room.
Because he was so upset.
He was so upset about this idea that anybody should be making money in any way.
Right. And obviously, I mean, I don't know his history, but knowing he came from an upper middle class family, and at this point is so disturbed by the concept of making money, you can tell that there's some pretty strong associations there. He probably did not have very good experiences around people who were, wealth generators. And yet, I mean, and that is the time period of life that he's in. That's what he's got to figure out. That's what he's going through right now. There's nothing wrong with that. However, we can get this idealized concept of money rejection or the next phase rejection. Like, I don't want to become this person that is the sort of the archetype in my brain about this next level of development. So I'm just going to reject that level of development. And that doesn't really serve us. So having a more neutral stance, having a less judgmental, more zoomed out, perspective on how all this works will open up our opportunities for development and growth, and could simultaneously open up our opportunities for affluence and influence. And so we're going to talk about in the next few podcasts, we're going to talk about wealth generation. We're going to talk about it as a personal development project. We're going to talk about it as, like a way to become better versions of yourself. We're going to talk about it as, the ways that we can influence the world around us. And we're going to talk about wealth generation through the lens of personality psychology, personality types, and maybe some of the stereotypes around personality types that are more and less successful at it. What kinds of wealth generation can we do? What kind, depending upon our type. But we wanted to set the stage for the next, few podcasts by really going down this road of, are you rejecting the concept of making money, and maybe prematurely? And could wealth generation be the next phase of your personal development?
Yeah. We want to hear from you. Has this resonated? Have you rejected past times in your life? Have you rejected going to the next level because you just don't want to, open yourself up to the new things you have to learn there? Has wealth creation not been a problem for you, and you figured out ways to make that totally, you're totally cool with it, and you feel like you're doing it in integrity? We want to hear your stories. This, again, is a discussion starter, not a discussion ender on these podcasts. Come over to facebook.com/personalityhacker. twitter.com/personalityhack, or of course, under this podcast at personalityhacker.com, there's a place for you to leave comments, feedback, ask questions. And what is so exciting about some of the things happening now on all of the social channels is the community is coming alive and there's discussion happening. And I love that, you're joining in with Antonia and I on this personal development, personal growth journey. We're doing it through the lens of personality psychology often. But really what we're all ultimately all in this together to do is to grow as people. And it's exciting to have you on board. So we want you to stop by, subscribe to this podcast, leave some feedback, let us know what you're feeling. And we'd love to have you be a part of this community.
Yeah, and if you are so moved, please go to iTunes and rate us and leave a review. Also, let us know what podcast topics you'd like us to address in a few future podcasts, and we will do our best to weave it in.
My name is Joel Markwitt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We'll talk to you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. Can't wait.